welcome back to Gold's Garage. And so I realize that there are more than 1 million other YouTube channels you could be watching right now. So thank you very much for watching Gold's Garage. And if you stick with me, I'll try to make it worth your while. I've been reading more Bill Jenkins and trying to adapt some of his concepts. Man, when you read this stuff, this book was written in the 70s. This guy was a genius. Some of his ideas that he had to make up, now you can buy commercial parts to do the same thing, and I'll explain that when I get going. So this video is really about crankcase evacuation, the various ways, why it's important, and ways to achieve it. And before I forget, also, we're filming this on Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day. Especially, about 10% of the viewers are ladies, so happy Valentine's Day to ladies. And so, just an update. First of all, this is Mike's Mopar engine. I've got it all stripped down. It's just waiting to go to the machine shop. We are now going to bore it. It's 30 thou over. I tried to clean it up. I said the cylinders were in good condition. One of them had a little bit of water stain on it. So we're going to bore it 40 thou. We're going to deck it 25 thou to get quench height in our compression, and hot tank it, acid dip it, pretty much everything that you can do. So it's just waiting to go. So Mike's race engine is also here. I mentioned before, I got my rad back. As you can see, I remounted the fan on the rad. The latest article, Mike's going to put a screenshot or a link to it in the description, says that, and it makes sense. The fan should also always be pulling air through the rad, not trying to push it. So I remounted it. The reason I didn't do that in the first place, I don't have much room. It's only a small fan, so I put it up in this corner. That's where the water is the hottest. So the delta T, the difference in temperature, is the greatest, so that's where the fan will be most efficient. Ideally, I should have more fans, but this engine stand was designed without a radiator and for the engine to go the other way, so I'm adapting it. Anyway, so a couple things to show about a future video. As you can see, back to the argument, does piping water from the rear of your cylinder head through the intake manifold to the front help or not? Is it a good thing to do? And there's obviously a difference of opinion. So I've got it mocked up. So what I did is I installed it's not a stainless steel AN fitting and pipe, but it conducts water from the rear to the front, as you can see, on one side only. I've got pressure and temperature gauges located at both points. And I've also got my thermal imaging camera. And I'm going to do some tests on the future video trying to see whether it does any good. Once again, I do not have that pipe, that line on the passenger side of the engine, so hopefully it's going to tell us something, and that's part of a future video. But one of the other things is, we're back to crankcase evacuation. I have installed a PCV valve on Mike's engine, and of course, there's the original valve cover, and that's a typical setup for a circle track engine we're talking now, cars that turn left all the time. That's the original valve cover. It doesn't have any openings at all. So in order to do that, I had to use another valve cover, and I've connected a PCV valve to Mike's engine. So why did I do that? Is it a good idea? I'm sure there'll be lots of interest in that. One of the the comments that I got, I talked about this earlier, is you're going to be sucking a bunch of contaminated air into the engine, and that may be true. Does that make a difference? Well, on the future dyno test, in that far corner, you can hardly see it, is Paul's 355. It's going to the dyno in 2 weeks from tomorrow. I'm actually going to make some pulls with and without the PCV valve connected, so that'll tell us whether that makes a difference. I've also connected a vacuum gauge to where the fuel pump goes. If Alec can come in, it's a tough shot, Alec, to get down to there. Right there, I've connected that vacuum hose goes up to here. Now, this kind of a test on an engine on the test stand doesn't really tell you anything because you can't really create much vacuum unless the engine's under load. So when we get to the dyno, I'm going to have Daryl, he typically connects a vacuum line to the carburetor for purposes of measuring vacuum on the dyno. So we're going to try and see if we can connect that to that fuel pump outlet, which is connected to the crankcase. What's the crankcase? Crankcase is everything below the piston rings in the oil pan, in the block, and that atmosphere also goes up into the valve covers. That's why we connect to the valve covers. It's access because it's the same atmosphere whether it's down there or up here. So hopefully that makes some sense. So future tests coming up, there's a vacuum, does PCV valve hurt engine performance? Do you have vacuum in your crankcase? And whether or not running that hose makes any sense. So we'll get to all that. So Alec can back up a little bit. Again, sorry, I'm moving around on you, Alec. So why is it important to have crankcase evacuation, I call it, okay? And why is it important? First of all, if you have pressure inside your oil pan in your crankcase, you will have seals leaking. It'll push, it's going to try and push that atmosphere out, and that's going to lead to more leakage. So if you have a negative pressure in your crankcase, it's not going to do that. Oil control, you're going to leak oil. Now, it's not less than worried about, the cost of a quart of oil, it's what it does. So the oil will get contaminated if you have a working, some kind of evacuation system, whether it's a PCV valve or some of the other methods that I'm going to describe here. Then when the engine gets hot and the oil's hot, there's always condensation in the engine, what's condensation? That's water, vapor, moisture. That moisture will evaporate and get sucked out of the engine through whatever system you're using, whether it's just a PCV valve or whatever it is. So that's why you want to do that. And detonation. So you go back to Jenkins, his concern was, and I paid a lot of money to Bill for this book, so I'm trying to make it worth my while by reading every word of it. His concern was, he doesn't care about losing a half a quart of oil on a run, that doesn't matter. What matters is, in a high compression engine like he was using, 13 or 14 to 1 compression ratio, any oil getting into the combustion chamber, whether it's going past the piston rings or through the valve guides, valve seals, valve guides, is the first thing that's going to trigger detonation. So that was his main concern, is to run real high compression pressures. And if you have a negative pressure on the bottom side of your rings, okay, you're not going to get oil going into the combustion chamber. If you have a positive pressure, you are. And so that's why crankcase evacuation is important. So first of all, let's just look at good, better, best. And so if Alec, just stay there, Alec, don't move, I got to go get something. So what the heck is this? This is the most primitive kind of crankcase evacuation. I took this pipe off of a Blue Flame 6. I built a Blue Flame 6 for a company in North Carolina, Osprey Custom Cars, about 4 or 5 years ago. And this is what was on it. And this was until about 1964 or so, I think 63 or 64. This pipe just was inserted into an opening in the casting in the block. The tube goes down, and this is just a separator to make sure that you don't draw oil out, you just draw the atmosphere out. So as the car's driving down the highway, any crankcase pressure, there's a negative pressure here from the motion of the car. Any motion here, the crankcase pressure will suck that contamination out, and that's the way they did it. And Bill Jenkins actually used these on his race car, and I'll explain why in a minute. So this just separates the oil from the atmosphere to make sure you're not drawing oil out. So, and in the old days, cars before the 60s, when they started to get, the engine started to get worn out, this looked like another exhaust pipe because all that contamination was getting by the piston rings and ending up there. And there's pictures of the interstate highways back in the day where there's a black streak down the middle of the highway, and that's what it was coming from, oil coming out of the bottom of this pipe. So Bill actually used this pipe, this part of it, in his race cars, and I'll explain that when I get back to it. So it's important to have crankcase evacuation. Now for a normal street engine, just a simple PCV valve connected to your carburetor properly, that's working properly, will do the trick. If it's a race engine, it's a different story. So, and one of the things, here's Trevor's race engine, and it's kind of like what I just described on Mike's. 2 breathers on the left side, on the driver's side, nothing on the right side. Why is that? Because when the car is in the corner, it's pulling about 1 G, 1 force of gravity. And for that reason, 1 G, the oil will stand up in the oil pan about 45 degrees. So if you had breathers over here, you'd have oil flying out of here, that's for sure. So on this side, you don't, because it's trying to go the other way. That's why they always have breathers on that side. But these engines, this is exactly the way crate engines come from the factory. This is the way most circle track guys are using their engines, on short tracks at least. And so why is that a problem? Well, when I got Mike's engine back here, as I said, I wanted to do some R&D on it, and I drained the oil out of it, and the oil was filthy. And it only had about 100 miles of racing. 4 races, 4 race nights, I think, on it. 25 lap features, and other heat race practice and all that. So it adds up to about 100 miles. So that's a lot, not very many miles to create that much contamination. So I thought, there must be a better way to do that. And so I have, as I've already described, I've already put a PCV system on Mike's engine. Now we're going to see whether that makes any sense or not. So let's just describe the various ways of crankcase evacuation. And I always start off with a pointer and then forget where it is. So good, better, and best. I guess I forgot to include in my list, I forgot to include this, which was until about 1964. And it was really done, the implementation or creation of this idea of a PCV valve, positive crankcase ventilation valve, was for atmosphere, for contamination, because all that stuff is going out onto the ground and contaminating the atmosphere. And cars before the 70s, once again, when they're idling, you could smell it, because that's all that contamination from your crankcase is going out in the ground. So that would be the first thing. And then valve cover breathers to the atmosphere. That's basically what I just described with the race car. There's no positive ventilation whatsoever. So PCV valve is kind of the standard. Most street cars have a PCV valve. When we take Paul's 355, once again, we're going to have a PCV valve on it, and that's the way Paul's going to take it away. And that works pretty good, and I'll describe to you how the PCV valve works. And then the crankcase evacuation system. There's the PCV valve. There's a crankcase evacuation system. Now that's the best I could come up with for a screenshot. And so these are the breathers that fit on the valve covers. And these pipes here, you have to create a bung in the header, at the end of the header. And that bung has to be welded in at about a 45 degree angle. So this end of the pipe goes into your header, into the streamer flow of the header. And between that this is the check valve, which gets screwed onto here, okay? And then you got hoses, obviously, going back up to the breathers from there. So what does that do? When you're at full throttle and high speed, you got very fast velocity in your header. That creates a negative pressure, and that negative pressure helps to evacuate your engine. So Jenkins actually created this didn't have these kits. You couldn't go to Summit back then, right? And look up the part number and order it. He actually used tubes like this connected to the engine instead for to use as an oil separator, and he installed a check valve as well. So then you have a dry sump system. So I'm going to come back and describe a dry sump system is the ultimate system. I'll come back and describe it. It's a very expensive system. You got a whole bunch of AN stainless steel lines running back and forth from the front of the car to the back. And I'll get in to describe that in a minute. So let's get back to positive crankcase ventilation. So here's the typical working of a PCV valve. That's the PCV valve, and we'll show you exactly this the valve that goes into your valve cover. And so it's a tapered valve with a spring connected to vacuum. So as you can see, it's trying to evacuate your oil pan. So when you're idling, basically the spring is trying to open the valve, okay, and the vacuum is trying to keep it closed. So when you're idling and you have lots of vacuum and you don't need evacuation very much because you don't have a lot of blow-by, that valve is closed, okay? When you're at full throttle and you don't have vacuum, the spring wins. When you're idling, the vacuum wins and it closes the valve. When you're at high speed, the spring wins. It opens the valve and allows flow from your crankcase and directly connected to the vacuum, which is in the vacuum port of your intake manifold. Okay, so that is the ultimate system, and that is a standard system that's on any typical street car. So for guys that don't want to do that on a race car, they go to this crankcase evacuation system. Is pretty common on drag racing cars. I don't know if I've ever, maybe they are. I don't know on circle track cars whether anybody's using that or not. I'd like to hear in the comments if they are using it. But it's pretty common on drag racing cars. There's another one that I jumped over, I didn't mention, is vacuum pump. So a lot of drag racers use actually a belt-driven pump. Looks this kind of like an alternator or something in the same area. And it actually pumps vacuum, evacuates your oil pan and maintains a negative pressure in the crankcase, so you don't have a positive pressure, and that keeps oil from getting up into the combustion chambers, which is one of the major reasons. And then the dry sump system. So I don't have a demonstration of that, but it's pretty unique. A lot of high-end drag racers use that. And then the dry sump system. So I think I've described the PCV system. I've described the crankcase evacuation system. So let's just talk about dry sump. So who uses dry sumps? Basically, it's an expensive system. So super late models, they call them now. Like when I raced them, all my race cars had dry sump systems. We just called them late models then, but now that there's pro late models, they call them super late models. And here's why it's expensive. So there are multiple lines. In this case, it shows 3 going into the pump. This pump is driven off of a cogged belt, driven by the crankshaft balancer on the crankshaft on the cogged belt, so that it's positive. Okay, so that pump has actually got a belt right on it at that location. Okay, so you're creating suction. That's the bottom of the oil pan. So when a dry sump engine is going down the racetrack, you could pull the oil plug out of it and probably nothing would come out, because the vacuum is so strong that it's evacuating that crankcase all the time. Okay, so that oil gets pumped into the pump. It's a multi-stage pump. In this case, it's a 4-stage pump. And then inside, it transfers that oil to create pressure, okay? And the intake of it is, of course, comes from the dry sump tank. Now, the dry sump tank is typically mounted behind the driver, most late models, super late model cars, and other kinds of race cars, behind the driver. And that dry sump tank will typically hold maybe 16 liters or quarts of oil. So oil change is pretty expensive on these cars. So that's oil is then getting sucked from the bottom of the dry sump tank up through now it's going pressure out through the filters, through the oil cooler, and they just drill and tap a port in the block somewhere, and I'll just point to, well, you can look here. In this case it's not drill and tap, but that connects right to an oil channel, and you can actually drill and tap, and typically they put an AN line. There's various ways of doing that. Once you pipe into your oil system in the block, you're pumped into it. It doesn't really matter where you go into it. So that pumps into the block, and that oils your, provides oil pressure. So that's the ultimate system. Why is that? Because you have total evacuation in your oil pan. You never have pressure. You always have a positive suction or a negative pressure in the oil pan. The oil pan is flat. You don't need anything else in there. And of course you don't even have an oil pump. So that allows also the oil pan to be shallower, and it gets the engine lower in the car. That's one of the other reasons they use it. So what's the negative? Well, it costs a lot of money. Creates more maintenance. And one of the other things, if you watch a NASCAR race, and often when they have a big crash, they have a fire, it follows, because these lines are running from the front to the back of the car. And if a crash is bad enough, if it breaks one of those lines, you got 300-degree oil coming out of there at 50 or 60 psi, depending whether it's pressure or vacuum, I guess. And that's what's the cause of a lot of fires. So, but anyway, that's the ultimate. But what is the purpose of it? Yeah, getting the engine lower, but the other purpose of it is creating a negative, evacuating the oil pan all the time. So those are the various ways that you can do that. So back to Mike's engine, what am I thinking? So the negative thing, and I commented on this in a previous video that I was going to do this, and someone said, well, you're going to have a bunch of, all that contaminated atmosphere from the oil pans going to be going into your engine and diluting the intake mixture and slowing you down. So we'll find out when we dyno it. Now, what Jenkins did in his book, and I'm intrigued by that, he actually connected using a pipe like this. He cut the pipe off, put a check valve right into the plenum of the intake manifold. So that created a lot of vacuum when the engine was at idle, because he needed to make sure he didn't get any oil in the cylinders. So that created the vacuum when the engine was at idle. Then when it was at full RPM, he actually did this, only he didn't have all these parts from Summit. He made them himself. He created breathers that connected the hoses to the headers back 1972 or something like that. So was this guy ahead of his time? Yes, he was. So that's what he did, and he recognized the value of it. His main determination was to prevent detonation. Now, you can care about losing a little bit of oil, but any oil that gets up, in fact, he, in his comments, said that it was so effective that they didn't use any valve seals on the engine at all. They also played around with the negative side was then you could suck atmosphere into the engine. They actually tried using the oil seals backwards, and that didn't work out. So anyway, this is the kind of guy he was. I don't know where he found all the time to do all that research, but it's always interesting reading from him and trying to learn. And we're going to eventually re-dyno Mike's engine again as well, with or without PCV valve. And we'll be back to you with future videos about Mike Kimball's, or Blakely Kimball's Mopar. As soon as we get it back from, we've got parts coming, and let's get to the machine shop next week. And we'll be doing a thermal test with my camera on the Mike's race engine in a future video. Hope you found that interesting. Please support my channel by liking and subscribing, all that stuff. I'm very, very fortunate to have a YouTube channel to share my interests with anybody that's willing to listen. Lots of smart guys out there that don't have that opportunity, and I just kind of backed into it. But it's now got me motivated. But it takes time and costs money, and so whereas subscribing doesn't cost any money. So if you could subscribe for me, that really helps more than you probably think. Every subscription, every like, if you show an interest, if you watch the video, YouTube says, hey, this guy's doing okay, we'll show him to his videos to more people. Hope you found that interesting. Thank you for watching Gold Scratch.